A red dawn rises in Britain as Labour wins the election on the 4th of July. The British left has been in shambles for a long time but is now recapturing governmental powers. Is it because Keir Starmer is brilliant and Labour has equally brilliant policy proposals? And was that brilliance the reason that the Tories imploded? Not really, as Matt Goodwin explains in today's episode. He's a political scientist, author, and probably the best guy to talk to if you want to understand British politics. So, if you like today's conversation, give him a follow here on Substack at mattgoodwin.substack.com, mattgoodwin.substack.com. But now for today's conversation. You're listening to Rak Höger with me, Ivar Arpi. Welcome, Matthew Goodwin, to Rak Höger.
Well, thanks for having me and a chance to welcome you to my Substack, Matt Goodwin Substack, where I'll also be featuring this conversation. So good to be with you again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And but I would just want to start off by picking your brain a little bit on the recent UK election, because on the 4th of July, Independence Day for all the Janks across the pond, as you say, there was a general election in Britain and Labour won a landslide victory, capturing 411 out of 650 seats in Parliament, a huge majority. So this must surely mean that the country is firmly in Labour's hands and that the social democratic winds are blowing across the land. A red dawn. Am I getting this right?
No, you're getting it wrong, but let me explain what's actually happened, because many people within the Labour Party will certainly tell you that as America looks set to re-elect Donald Trump and now J.D. Vance on the ticket, and as Europe has moved, I think, decisively right at the European Parliament elections, including in countries like yours and Sweden that we'll come back to talk about later on. Many Labour MPs will tell you that, well, we've bucked the trend, and what we've got in this country is a big upsurge of public enthusiasm for centre-left social democratic politics. Now, personally, I don't find that narrative convincing. On the one hand, yes, it's true. Keir Starmer and the Labour Party have won the biggest majority since Tony Blair in 1997. They can now pretty much do whatever they want to do in terms of their legislative agenda for the next 5 years, with little opposition from the Conservatives. The Conservatives were reduced to their lowest number of seats in history. But actually, the story of what happened is slightly more complicated. Here's a couple of things to consider. The first is the level of turnout fell to its lowest level since the 1880s. The combined share of the vote for the two big parties fell to its lowest share since the modern two-party system began. And Labour won a big majority, yes, but on the lowest share of the national vote for any incoming majority government since the end of the 19th century. What am I saying here? I'm saying there is no mass public enthusiasm for this Labour Party. What this election was about is it was a punishment election. It was a punishment election of a Conservative Party that had fundamentally lost touch with the country. So Labour benefited, yes, partly because Keir Starmer had reshaped his party around an image of sort of pseudo moderation and competence, although we can come back and talk about that. The main story was the Conservative vote share absolutely collapsed to 23% of the vote, and the Conservatives were not just hit by millions of voters giving up on the party and about 1 in 5 of their voters defecting to Labour. They were hit by Nigel Farage and the National Populist Reform Party.
Yeah, because you wrote a great. I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but yeah, I just wanted to make a small commercial for your Substack. So sorry for interrupting you by quoting you, because you wrote a great piece on the 13th of July, this Saturday, and you wrote ever since their historic defeat at the general election, more than a few members of the Tory elite class have decided to leave reality for cloud cuckoo land. And you had a great great poll, a picture from a poll, like what if you look at the 2019 elections, how did those voters vote this time around? And as you say, it's not just that people from the Tory party, the voters, like all of a sudden they got really enthusiastic about Labour and decided that Keir Starmer is the best thing since sliced bread, and Labour unions, of course. But they went somewhere else, and that somewhere else is Nigel Farage's party. And why did they do that, do you think?
One word: immigration. That was the primary reason why the 2019 Conservative Party electorate imploded. Lots of senior Tory elites are now trying to convince themselves that this wasn't about immigration. This was about a general sense of competence. It was about a general sense of distrust. It was about delivery and public services. Nigel Farage is the main threat to the Conservative electorate, and the reason he attracted basically 1 in 4 of Boris Johnson's voters. As we've been saying in our Substack for 2 years, this was going to happen. He did that because those voters want the small boat invasion on the borders to stop, and they want legal immigration to be dramatically reduced. Those were the 2 main reasons. So, look, what I'm trying to say here is this is also only the beginning of this problem for the Conservatives, right? Because if they draw the wrong conclusions from their defeat, and they don't understand that Nigel Farage and the Reform Party are the principal threat to their survival as a viable political party, they will not survive. They will eventually collapse, and they will be replaced by the Reform Party or some kind of realigned conservative movement. It's very clear why people defected. So the first point that I'm trying to make here to the Conservatives, some of whom are listening, some of whom are not, and we can come and talk about the leadership candidates in a second. But the first point I'm making is, look, if you don't reunify, if you don't unify the right, if you don't accept that Nigel Farage is as much a Conservative as Suella Braverman, as David Cameron, as Theresa May, as Boris Johnson, if you don't deal with this Farage wing, the Conservatives will never be in a competitive, viable position to win an election going forward, because he's not on 5% of the vote. He's on 15 to 20% of the vote. And he's attracting a lot of former Conservative voters who are saying, this is where Trump comes in, they're saying, we don't want liberal conservatism anymore. We don't want the conservatism of 2010 to 2015 anymore. We want the Trump, J.D. Vance kind of conservatism, not necessarily Trump, but we want strong borders, lower migration, an economy that puts British people ahead of others, a capitalism that's sensitive to the fact that global corporations can be ruthless and manipulative and self-serving, and a conservatism that actually stands up and says, we're not just going to erode and dilute our national community through things like mass immigration and open borders. And that essentially is what's going on here. We're now living through a civil war within the Conservative Party for the future of conservatism and the future of the country.
And if you look at, of course, we have different electoral systems. So if this was Sweden, there would perhaps have been a different, everything would have been different, because then Labour wouldn't have captured so many seats, because we have a proportional election system. And it has its downsides and its upsides. And if you look at the United States, you have 2 main parties instead, and it's more similar to Britain. But there you can see that within the Republican Party, the Nigel Farage wing have sort of edged out the Tory wing of the Republican Party, like the new right has edged out the old right, or the liberal conservative right. The Reaganomics right has been diminished within the Republican Party. And but the same thing is going on in Sweden as well. Right now we have the Sweden Democrats. It's not exactly the same as that as Trump, of course. It's not the same as Nigel Farage, of course. There are similarities and differences, but it's basically a similar battle within the right. And of course, here we have a government that is right-wing and with the support of Sweden Democrats. But we will see in the next election. I mean, if the Sweden Democrats continues to grow and the moderate party, the traditional right-wing party, continues to diminish, then the power relations between them will probably mean that the Sweden Democrats wants to be in the government. But it's also, I would say, a battle of the soul of the right. You use the word conservative, and I think you in the English speaking world, I think that's the correct word to use. But in like a European context and Swedish context, right wing perhaps is more useful, because conservative has a very negative connotation in Swedish for some reason. But
I think as well, looking at Sweden and also looking at France and Italy and the Netherlands and Austria reminds us that what we've just experienced in the UK is part of a global trend, which also tells us that much of the post-election analysis, which has simply pointed at Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, scandals during COVID-19, that these were the reasons why the Conservative Party was demolished. Well, actually, if you look globally, we know the situation is actually much more complex, and that the reason national populism, ultra-conservatism, whatever your preferred term, the reason why these parties are doing very well, not just in the UK, but Sweden, which was one of the first to really, I think, go through this in recent years, where I remember being in Sweden a few years ago and people on both the left and the right were saying to me, look, there is now an emerging consensus that actually mass immigration has been a disaster for Sweden with the gang violence and so on, and we'll come back to that. But I go to France, I hear the same thing. I go to the Netherlands, I hear the same thing. I go to Italy. And these parties, like Trump, are clearly benefiting from a very strong public desire to lower immigration, slow down cultural and demographic change, protect the borders, reassert our distinctive identity, history, culture, ways of life. And the only people who don't seem to have understood the wider trends rumbling through Western democracies are the British Tory elite class, who basically want the Conservative Party here to continue to reflect the values of an elite minority, not the values of what I would call the forgotten majority. You know, the people who basically are saying, I don't really want to live in this status quo anymore, including, by the way, lots of young Zoomers from Gen Z who, you know, there's a surprisingly significant level of support for Nigel Farage among Zoomers, much like I think in the US, Barry Weiss and a few others have written recently about the Zoomers turning to Trump. And in Europe, we saw a lot of younger voters voting for Le Pen, voting for national populist parties. So the post-election analysis in the UK has been very, very weak. It's been, you know, all about cognitive dissonance, people basically convincing themselves to see what they want to see in the data. Whereas we've taken a very different view. We've just kind of stepped back and said, okay, here's actually what's going on. This is what the evidence is telling us is going on, which is why I think we've been ahead of the curve. But tell us a bit about perhaps Sweden and Europe as well, how you see it, because these global wins, I think, are really only just getting going.
Yeah, I think sometimes when you talk about wins and you talk about very large regions like global wins, my feeling, at least when I talk to Swedes and politicians and activists here in Sweden, they sometimes get comforted by the fact that there's like a conservative wind or a populist wind, and it's almost like the struggle within Marxism 100 more than 100 years ago. Like, will the revolution come because of the material deterioration for the working class, or do the working class have to do something about it? And like one of the reasons for the rise of why the Social Democrats were so weak in Germany in the early 20th century was that many of them saw that we just sit back and let everything go to waste, and then the working class will be activated and the revolution will happen. So that's one reason why I try to say to people here that it's not a wind that will just come and fill your sail. You must do something if you want to change. I'm speaking now less as I'm not an academic, and I was speaking less as a journalist and more like an activist right now. What I see is that something that's been very pronounced in Britain and from you and from others in Britain is that you've actually had governments in the difference between one difference between Britain and Sweden is that we have had a lot of left-wing governments during crucial years during the migration crisis, but you've actually had Tory governments for decades almost, and they've all promised to be tougher on immigration, and they've all promised that they will be increase the patrolling of borders, and they will solve the small boat crisis. They've all said that, but they haven't delivered on it. And it's the same in Sweden, and it's the same all across Europe. You've had right-wing governments, they say one thing and they do another. And the chicken's coming home to roost, so to speak.
If I could just come in on just 2 points there. The first is agency versus structure. So one of the arguments, and I agree with you historically, for new parties is you don't actually need to be activists because structures will break down and people will come to you, whether on the left or the right. What was clear in the UK election is that basically isn't true, that what essentially Farage and Reform had to do was, while there was lots of demand in the country for a challenge to the elite consensus of big state, big tax, big debt, big immigration, big on woke, or at least woke adjacent, Nigel Farage and Reform had to go out there and supply that demand with a message and a party. Now, they got 4 million votes, they got 5 members of parliament, and they got nearly 100 second places, many of which came in Labour seats. What was remarkable to me about that campaign is how they did all of that basically with no viable, serious party structure. One of their activists joked to me during the campaign, said, "We are building the plane while we are flying at supersonic speed," right? And so it was a reminder not only of the need to go out there and campaign for votes, but actually how much impact you can have with a very weak, volatile, thin party structure, which has very little money and very little manpower, which then raises the obvious question, well, what on earth could you achieve if you had a serious party structure with a serious party organization with a mass membership? Now, Reform are currently up to about 60, 70,000 members. The Conservatives, as far as we know, have around 100 to 120,000, but I suspect that's a lot lower now. So what we're also beginning to see is a kind of organizational competition for the future of the right as well, Farage making some important appointments. So the first thing I would say is, when you look at the UK election and you look at the return of Farage, right, part of this is I don't think he's come close to actually mobilizing the real potential that exists. And the second thing to say is about the Conservative Party that was in government for 14 years. The Conservative Party essentially has been taken over by a southern, Oxbridge-educated, socially liberal, status-obsessed, fiscally liberal elite class that doesn't really understand who has been voting for them since Brexit and why those people have been voting for them. Had the Conservative Party understood what Donald Trump has understood in the US, which is what is driving the political realignment across Western democracies, then they would have done a lot better. But instead, from Boris Johnson, who never really understood who was voting for him, Boris Johnson was a Bohemian liberal, he was not a conservative, through to Rishi Sunak, who was appointed with no mandate. He did not have a democratic mandate to be prime minister, and he was more of a technocrat, a managerial figure than a genuine conservative with an understanding of ordinary people. which was perhaps best symbolized when he was asked during the election campaign, well, what did you go without when you were a child? How did you struggle? To which his answer was, we didn't have Sky News, which people with Sky tend to be, fairly privileged and secure. But of course, for many people in the country, this was a ridiculous comment because, they're struggling to afford food and school uniforms. But what the Conservatives morphed into was a party essentially for the 10 to 15% liberal Conservatives, whereas Farage is now mobilizing cultural Conservatives. And I have said this in a more recent piece, that what would genuinely scare me if I was on the moderate liberal Tory side of this debate is Farage's electorate is socially distinctive, is geographically concentrated, is ideologically aligned, is very, very hacked off with that Tory elite class, and shows very little inclination to return to the Conservative Party. So what would terrify me if I were now, coming in to take over the Conservative Party is actually, can I get this party off life support? Can I actually turn this party around? Because the obstacles, organizational, ideological, philosophical, they're just so great. I mean, nobody in the Conservative Party who's going to stand for leadership so far has demonstrated any understanding of what conservatism should really be in 2024. This isn't like Margaret Thatcher in 1978, 79, who was coming in with a very different vision, or who had a theory of inflation, of how to change the economic model. And it isn't really like Tony Blair in 97, and it isn't really like David Cameron in 2005, who, he was a very thin, intellectually thin politician, but he had a sense of where the Conservatives needed to go, albeit that the diagnosis was not the right one. What worries me is the Conservatives today, I don't think really understand where they need to go. They are completely lost.
But I think it's if you look at France, for example, you have the old right basically obliterated, and what they said, the party leader for the old traditional right party said that we should support Le Pen and her party, Marine Le Pen. And there was a internal conflict, but that's where they landed. And you have this conflict all over. But one thing, if when I speak to mainstream right-wing politicians about woke, for example, or identity politics, what to do about it, cancel culture, many of them understand the problem, but they get scared as soon as the critics come out. They get very scared, and they don't want to. They are very scared that they will sort of go foul on some classical liberal principle in theory, and if they do that, then they their membership card of the good right will be rescinded from the left. Sort of deals out these cards like you're a good right wing, and that will be rescinded if they become too critical. So when push comes to shove, every time, at least that's my experience in Sweden, the only ones who are willing to stand up against many of these new issues are the Sweden Democrats. Now, I'm not saying that they have all the solutions, but they know where the struggle is, and they know that they have public support, and they know who they are. And the traditional right, they know who they are when it comes to the. You mentioned Margaret Thatcher. Many of them are very nostalgic about Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. They have like these T-shirts to go around like Reagan, like old T-shirts from the 80s and stuff. Because when it comes to the economic issues, they feel very at home. But of course, those issues aren't what's at the forefront now.
Absolutely.
And I would say that, I mean, this is an academic debate, but what right wing and left wing really means, I'm in the camp of saying that it probably doesn't mean anything, except that it means everything, but the meaning shifts over time. And if you're right wing today and you're conservative today, you must have an answer to today's issues. You can't have an answer to yesterday's issues. I mean, even if it privatize the public sector, that's a great battle cry in the 70s. It's not the greatest battle cry today, especially not in Sweden, I would say. Yeah, you probably lose a lot of votes by doing that.
I guess I would frame it in terms of conservatives in the 1980s were justifiably concerned about economic freedom. I think conservatives of the 2020s really need to think a lot more about cultural freedom. And I think that essentially is reflecting this deeper point that rolling back the state in the 80s was an understandable reaction to the lingering Cold War and to a state that had become overloaded and inefficient. But in the 2020s, it's very clear that the state and the government institutions have also become politicized. And the cultural and demographic changes that the elite class have imposed on everybody else have left a majority of voters feeling very disillusioned and disgruntled with the state of politics. So the reason national populism is connecting, but also the reason that some conservatives are still able to do very well, and I'd include the Republicans in that and some European politicians, is because they've recognized how the foundations of politics have moved. And they've also recognized, by the way, that the previous unbridled acceptance and celebration of global free trade, the liberalization of finance, of deregulation, was not always in the interests of the national community. It was not always in the best interests of Western workers, because we now know, for example, and we don't need to rehash the arguments here, but we know that hyper-globalization from the 1990s onwards had disastrous effects for the working class in Western economies. And we know from the great financial crash onwards that this sort of fetishization of financial services, especially in the UK, led to a wholesale outburst of corruption and greed that screwed over the British people and many people in other Western states, right? And I haven't seen much serious reflection yet among contemporary conservatives who are still struggling to understand why populists are breaking through. And those populists are saying, we don't want crony capitalism. We don't want unfettered globalism. We don't want big corporates actually selling the national community out at the first opportunity. We want a greater dose of protectionism. Now, that's not the same as redistribution. This is where I think many moderate conservatives start to misunderstand what's going on. They hear the words like Trump, they hear the words patriotic protectionism, and they think, oh, that's not capitalism, that's not free trade. But actually what they're doing with a lot of those policies, or what Trump's doing, or what, say, Le Pen's advocating, is saying, if you are not actively going to work in the interests of the national community, if you as a global corporation are not going to work in the interests of the British people or the French people or the American people, then we are going to ensure there are consequences for that. And I think that is a perfectly reasonable place for any conservative politician to stand, because it's not just about allowing the free market to function and work. It is also about ensuring that free market, that market works in the interests of the national community. Otherwise, we're not conservatives, we're libertarians. And I think that's
there's been a misunderstanding that that's the same thing. And of course, the interests have been aligned, but less so the last 10, 15, 20 years. And that's why you see the growth of the so-called populist right. I would also say that crony capitalism in Sweden, we have a unique school system that maybe not as widely known internationally, where we have invited companies to go to make profit out of having schools. So you have big corporations with schools all over the country, and they are paid for by tax money. But it's also possible for the companies to take out a profit. And the people in charge of these policies are the politicians. They are the ones setting the boundaries and the laws of how these corporations are, how the school market works. But in the companies, they recruit the same politicians all the time from all the political parties, and including the Social Democrats. And so you have your old party leader contacting you when you are in charge of these policies and saying, come on, can't we make a deal? And all of a sudden a deal is made, and it's made across the aisle because the Social Democrats are in on it. And basically the only ones who are not in on it are the old Communist Party, and hats off to them for that, because they're very critical, and they have not been corrupted as far as I know from this. And as a social issue, if it used to be that if you mention that you're critical against the migration policy in Sweden, or you support the Sweden Democrats or something like that, you could be shunned by your friends, your family. You could be kicked out of social of your community, basically, and your so it was and it's still a cost, but it used to be much higher. But if you're in the public sphere as an intellectual or a journalist, and you say and you spell it out that these are the connections, how are our public sector, how is it run, by which corporations, and who are in charge, and how connect the dots between these people, that's a very steep cost. And I wrote a piece on Substack about this, and I was contacted by pretty close friends, and they basically said that I'm so disappointed in you, like the whole thing that would have been like if it was 15 years ago, 10 years ago, or maybe 5 years ago, about migration or immigration, then it would have been that issue. But this issue is because it's both the big left-wing party and all the right-wing parties. They are aligned. And if you ask the public, yes, they want to be able to pick the school for the kids themselves. Yes, they don't want to be forced by the state, like, because you live here, you're supposed to go to that school, like it used to be. But they are, like, I think it's 80 or over 80% are also against that corporations take tax money for profit. But if you say that, like I'm saying it now, I'm a bad conservative. I'm basically a bad social democrat. I sound like a communist in Swedish context, even though it's like a huge majority are in line with what I'm saying right now.
But I think it sounds as though what you are saying is sort of opposition to corporatism, that there is a sort of elite conspiracy to control certain industries and sectors of the country that isn't giving sufficient choice to the Swedish people. And, you know, if you think about the direction of European politics more generally, I mean, I've always been struck by the case of Austria and how the Freedom Party in Austria really emerged from the 80s by doing exactly that, which was opposing the so-called social partnership in Austrian politics, opposing the sort of corporatist dividing up of society between the established blocks, and is now back.
You could basically get you could basically get jobs, apartments, houses, like everything. You could do it all via the party system. It's crazy. Even from a Swedish standpoint, we are really good at corporatism. But corporativism, but they went really far. You could actually understand why you named yourself the Freedom Party. It sounds a little bit like it's not a good name in many contexts, but in Austria, I totally get it.
But to go briefly back to the UK for a minute, the other reason that I think Farage connected was that he was basically saying something not completely dissimilar, in that, you know, established left and right are basically now unified. What we might call the Uni Party is unified around a new post-Brexit consensus, which is acceptance of a very big state, acceptance of a big welfare state, acceptance of high tax, acceptance of mass immigration, acceptance of high debt, very expensive debt, an acceptance of a very expensive national health service, which isn't working for ordinary people, and an acceptance that we will not leave international courts and treaties that might allow us to control our own borders. So on lots of key issues now, there really isn't any difference between left and right, which if you think about the looming Conservative leadership contest this summer, the contest to replace Rishi Sunak, what will be interesting is if the Conservatives choose a one-nation liberal leader who basically signs up to much of that consensus, say Tom Tugendhat, for example, there is going to be enormous space in British politics for somebody like Nigel Farage and Reform. They'll have even more space. So I don't think we have yet seen the end of this debate, but it's that collusion that voters are now becoming aware of, which is why, again, one in eight of them, nearly 1 in 5, have been defecting to Farage and Reform in the polls. Because what they're saying, if you actually look at the manifesto that Farage had, or the contract document at the election, it had some very clear dividing lines with the big parties. They wanted an immediate freeze on immigration. They wanted to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. They wanted to end basically woke teaching in schools. Conservatives have never really said that. They wanted to end net zero policies. Conservatives certainly haven't said that. And they wanted to completely reform the electoral system. They wanted proportional representation, which neither of the two big parties officially support. So there were lots of dividing lines. And if the Conservatives veer left, which I suspect they will do, I mean, there's no way, I don't think, that they'll allow somebody like Suella Braverman to become leader. I just don't think the Conservative Parliamentary Party would ever allow that to happen. So if they veer left, I suspect we'll see a rump of the Conservatives breaking off to Reform, potentially, and Farage will have even more space.
And we haven't spoken anything about we'll jump to the United States in a little bit, because I think I've had a few days off, so I haven't written anything about it. But the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and as a European, sometimes it feels like everybody's getting shot in the United States, but it's actually it's been a while since a president was shot in the United States, even though there have been a few. And it was very close. He got hit in the ear, just a few centimeters in another direction, and it would have been he could have been shot and died. And I just wanted to hear what you think will be, because just when that happened, everybody was talking about Joe Biden and his geriatrics. Like, is he still there? Is he capable? I mean, it's obvious that he's a very old man, and he's aged a lot in a short time, and he has a hard time finishing sentences, following through training thought, and it's just he does seem that he's out of it, but everybody was talking about that. Will he be replaced? Who will replace him then? And then this happened, and will it increase Donald Trump's chances to win the presidential election, do you think, or does it make a difference at all, or what will happen because of it, do you think?
Well, my read is that Trump was already gaining ground in the polls before the assassination attempt. So during the aftermath of the debate, where Joe Biden was visibly weak compared to Trump, the swing states and the national polling had already been on the move. So, I pointed out that Trump was already stronger than he was in 2016, including in the key 7 states that will decide the 2024 US election. Then we saw the opening of the Democrat Party in terms of prominent Democrats calling for Biden to go. Well, we know voters hate divided parties, so that, I think, it's a fair assumption to say that has further weakened Joe Biden's position. From George Clooney to members of the House essentially saying Biden should go. Then the assassination attempt came in. Then Trump's reaction to the assassination attempt, which I personally thought was absolutely remarkable, to demonstrate that degree of, whatever you think of Trump and his politics, For anybody to experience an assassination attempt and to respond with that degree of courage and strength in that moment, I think will have made millions of Americans instinctively compare and contrast Donald Trump with Joe Biden. And I think that will benefit Trump. I think his pick as VP of JD Vance is a good move. I think JD Vance is younger. I think he's got appeal among the white working class. I think he's got a story, a life story that will reinforce Trump's strengths in the Midwest swing states, in the Rust Belt. I think it will offset Joe Biden's supposed strength among the white working class, which I always think has been exaggerated. And I think JD Vance represents a handover of the Trumpian tradition or the ideology to a younger generation. I think Trump genuinely is I think JD Vance is very close to where Trump is ideologically now, particularly on capitalism, globalization, and China. And he's made some, he's obviously where Trump is in terms of immigration. So look, I think Trump's in a stronger position. But the one thing you didn't mention, which struck me while watching the footage of the assassination attempt, is, and Americans have said this to me, if that assassination attempt had been successful, it is not completely implausible that it would have been followed by mass violence in the US, with many Republicans concluding that actually Trump had been assassinated by the political opposition, because it is such a febrile atmosphere. And I thought Joe Biden's reaction, by the way, to the assassination attempt speech that he gave, sort of comparing the assassination attempt to acts of violence on Democrats, I didn't think was as good as it could have been. Because the reality is, like I wrote on Substack, if you're going to try and convince the American people that they are on the cusp of an Adolf Hitler-style dictatorship, and that they're about to witness the end of their democracy and their republic, which is what senior Democrats have been saying, I'm sorry, there are consequences to that, and they need to row back from that rhetoric. Trump might be a radical, reactionary populist. Personally, I don't think he's a fascist. I don't think he's at all equivalent to Adolf Hitler, but the liberal catastrophizing that has been going on over the last 6 months has been outrageous. And I think Democrats need to hold their hands up too. But I'd be interested in your reflections as well, because it does feel that America is at a tipping point.
Yeah, I think we're in a few of the Western democracies right now, people are on the right are voting for something. They're voting for change. They want change, and you can see that in France. You can see when Bardella and Le Pen, when they are campaigning on issues that people are really upset about: gang violence, immigration, farmers, French farmers, and how they are treated, and like they are campaigning on these issues that are important to French people. And on the other side, people were campaigning against them. And it's the same in the United States, and it's been the same in Sweden. You're campaigning against the Sweden Democrats, or you're campaigning against Trump. What will happen if Trump wins? That's basically the argument for the Democrats. And so I think there's an energy on the right that there's actually people want change there, and it's not always been like that. It's been like it shifts over the years. But I think JD Vance is also interesting as a pick for his running mate. If you just look at the United States, because I read his book Hillbilly Elegy when it came out, and I loved it because I mean I love the whole toxic masculinity of the Appalachian white male, and the book is filled with great anecdotes, like just from a literary perspective. But also I like that he the whole story of from rags to riches, basically, about him. But what was interesting was that he was very much a regular mainstream Republican in many of his conclusions in that book, and also when he was plugging the book in the interviews, because he was called to, like, why are people voting for Trump? The book came out in 2016. Of course, Trump was elected in 2016 and the Brexit vote was in 2000. And he was one of the most sought after experts on why this was happening. And he was very critical of Trump, and he was very critical on protectionism. He was very like, you need to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, like the whole regular liberal conservative mantra. And since then he's shifted, and he of course he's apologized to Trump, and they've making amends, and now he's very aligned. So in like a microcosm, he's the change of the mood in the right-wing party. And of course you could say he's fake and he's just doing it to better his career, and of course that's part of it. But it might also be that when the way you get ahead when you're young, you've written a book, everybody likes you, everybody thinks your book is amazing, and you don't want to alienate people. You say some things that you think you have to say, and now those things, you don't have to say those things anymore. You don't have to say that free trade is the best thing ever, and you don't have to say globalization is great, immigration is all kinds of immigration at all levels are fantastic. You don't have to say those things anymore. So he personifies the change within the Republican Party and within the American right, I would say.
But if anything, that narrative itself also becomes problematic for the Democrats, right? Because J.D. Vance will now be saying, I used to think what lots of people out there think about Trump, but now I've got to know the man. Now I've got to know what he's about. So I think it's a real problem for the Democrats. It is going to exacerbate the current crisis they're in, because there is no... My personal view is there's absolutely no way Biden can win this. There is a way that he can win this election, but it is incredibly unlikely that he will win this election. So I suspect as we head towards a convention, there is going to be a push to either change the ticket or remove him and have Harris with somebody else. But there are no good options for the Democrats here. That's the fascinating thing.
And the reason I think Biden has stuck around for so long is that he's the last generation of Democrat that so many people still find they have few objections to. Like, he can claim that he's an older kind of Democrat, but all the other ones, all the later iterations, generations of Democrats, they are different kinds of woke, identity politics, radicals, socialists. I think when he leaves, it will be a free for all, and we will see which side comes out on top.
Absolutely. Well, listen, it's been great to talk as well. So what we'll be doing is send this to our subscribers, and obviously if they want to follow our accounts and keep up with the conversation, that would be great. I've always benefited from your insights, particularly, not exclusively, but particularly on Sweden, which I think is so important in terms of actually understanding how the zeitgeist in Western politics is changing, because the transformation of Swedish politics tells us a lot, actually, I think, about the transformation of the West, particularly on issues around migration and multiculturalism. So I've been a big fan for a long time, and I hope my subscribers engage with your work and engage with your analysis. But it's been great to catch up today.
Yeah, great catching up, Matthew. And where can people go to find more from you? Matthew, is it Matt Goodwin?
Just Matt Goodwin Substack. You'll find it. They'll find it on the app and elsewhere. And it's been great to actually go on the Substack journey as well, because the reason I suspect, like you, the reason I got involved was because professionally, financially, socially, being insulated from the legacy institutions is incredibly important if you're a countercultural thinker, if you're a countercultural analyst and writer. And the ecosystem that we're now building through things like Substack, but also YouTube and the other forums, all the new shows that are coming out, I really do genuinely believe is critically important to changing the zeitgeist more generally, because those legacy institutions now, I think, feel that competition, which is a good thing. And anyway, catch up soon.
Yeah, thank you, Matt Goodwin.
Thanks. Bye-bye.